A person's last words can tell you what they value, what's important to them. Or it can just tell you what's on their mind in that moment. The famous philosopher Socrates, his last words, "Please don't forget to pay the debt." Apparently, he owed a small debt to somebody and wanted to make sure that it was taken care of. Alexander the Great, he was asked, to whom will you give your kingdom? His response turned out to be his final words. "To the strongest," he said. Fast forward several centuries to the explorer Marco Polo. His final words? Well, his final words indicated that he hasn't even told half of what he had seen. The famous artist Michelangelo said, "I'm still learning." In our modern day, in our culture, final words can become sort of a rally cry to get behind a cause. Eric Garner, as he was pinned down by NYPD officers, said, "I can't breathe." And it became a rallying cry. On September 11th, 2001, Todd Beamer, a passenger of Flight 93, spoke the words, "Let's roll," before he and several others charged and attacked some terrorists trying to fly the plane into some building that would kill thousands of lives. Someone's last words carry weight. And it seems like Joshua wanted 2 chances to speak some famous last words, 2 chances to issue some sort of a rallying cry, because he gives 2 different farewell speeches, one in chapter 23 and the second one in chapter 24. And these speeches, they have some similarities, but they're also unique. Chapter 23 is addressed to the leaders of the tribes. Chapter 24 is addressed to all the people. Chapter 23 takes place in Shiloh, although it's never explicitly mentioned. That's the last place that was mentioned, so we assume it's still there. Chapter 24, we're told it takes place in Shechem. For the sake of our time in this session, we're just going to focus on the first of Joshua's 2 farewell speeches, Joshua chapter 23. This particular farewell speech, it looks pretty similar to the farewell speech given by Moses. Both of them call the people of Israel to remember God's faithfulness. Remember how God kept all of his promises. The question is not whether God is faithful to Israel, whether or not God had failed Israel. God had never failed. The question becomes, will Israel fail God? Will Israel be faithful to God? And it all depends on the choices they make. As this passage begins, the author sets the scene for us in verses 1 and 2 of Joshua 23. After a long time had passed, and the Lord had given Israel rest from all their enemies around them, Joshua, by then a very old man, summoned all Israel, their elders, leaders, judges, and officials, and said to them, "I am very old." As the scene gets set for us, 3 details kind of stand out. Detail 1, a long time has passed. We don't know exactly how long, but scholars estimate that around 25 years have probably passed from the end of their battles, leading all the way through chapter 12, and until this point in time in chapter 23. Second detail that stands out, Joshua is a very old man. We find out from the next chapter that Joshua dies at the age of 110. We don't know how much time has elapsed from chapter 23 to chapter 24, but probably not a whole lot of time. He knows that his time is short, it's running out, and he wants to share with them these words of wisdom. But the mention of Joshua being a very old man, it also links us back to chapter 13, verse 1, which is where the inheritance chapters begin. And so we're to see everything from 13:1 to 23:1 as kind of bracketed together by Joshua's age. Third detail that kind of stands out is that God has given Israel rest. He has provided the rest that he promised to the people of Israel. And the people of Israel have not been a people of rest. For hundreds of years, they're in captivity as slaves in Egypt. God delivers them, and they wander through the wilderness for 40 years. And for the last several decades, they've been battling and acquiring land. No rest for the people of God. But now, in this moment, they rest. They enter into the reality of the rest that God has promised. And as they enter into this reality, it's here that Joshua wants to challenge them, wants to encourage them. And as he begins his speech, he does so using a simple pattern that he repeats. It's kind of an A-B pattern that gets repeated 3 different times. A-B, A-B, A-B. Here's the pattern. The A section, we'll use the word remember. The people of God are to remember God's faithfulness. Remember all the ways that God has kept his promise. The B section of the cycle, we'll use the word obey. They are to carefully obey God's instructions. Be faithful to do exactly what God says. Let's see how this cycle plays out the first time, starting in verse 3 through 5. This is the A portion of the first cycle. Joshua encourages the people of Israel to remember God's faithfulness to keep his promises. In verse 3, he says, "You yourselves have seen everything the Lord your God has done to all these nations for your sake. It was the Lord your God who fought for you. Remember how I have allotted as an inheritance for your tribes all the land of the nations that remain, the nations I conquered, between the Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea in the west. The Lord your God himself will push them out for your sake. He will drive them out before you, and you will take possession of their land, as the Lord your God promised you." They are to remember God's faithfulness to keep his promises. God has been faithful. And he reminds them of everything they've witnessed with their own eyes. I mean, everything that we've talked about in the previous 11 sessions. That God has been faithful to keep his promise. They are to remember how God fought for them. In all those battles, they didn't win those victories in their own strength, their own might, their own power. No, it was God fighting on their behalf. He's the one who fought for them. They're to remember the inheritance, God's generosity, what he has provided for them. They're to remember how God himself continues to act, to work on their behalf, pushing out and driving out the inhabitants of the land. Notice that phrase, driving out. It's a change from the battle narratives back in chapters 6 through 12. Back then, it was devote to destruction. Different language now, drive out. Destruction, that was a one-time command. But that window has closed. That ship has sailed. Now the focus is on driving them out. And God will continue to work on their behalf in that regard. He will be faithful to continue working on their behalf. And so they are to remember God's faithfulness. But as we move to the B part of the cycle, now we have a challenge or a warning to obey very carefully the instructions that God has given. We see this in verses 6 through 8. "Be very strong. Be careful to obey all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, without turning aside to the right or to the left. Do not associate with these nations that remain among you. Do not invoke the names of their gods or swear by them. You must not serve them or bow down to them. But you are to hold fast to the Lord your God, as you have until now." Notice that Joshua begins with 2 commands, 2 imperatives. Be strong Be careful. And these two commands, they work in tandem. They partner together. If they are going to carefully obey all that God has said, they're going to have to be strong. They're going to have to hold fast to God so that they don't kind of swerve toward the lifestyle of the Canaanites who inhabit the land still. Data on driving reveals to us that our car tends to drift in whatever direction that we look. So if we look off in one direction for a while, our car begins to drift in that direction. If we look off in the other direction for a while, then our car begins to drift in that direction. And the same is true in life. When we watch something closely, we tend to drift in the direction of what it is we watch. We tend to veer in the direction of whatever we imitate. The Israelites could find it very tempting to drift in the direction of Canaanite living. Canaanite culture was more advanced, more developed, more sophisticated than the primitive Israelite culture of their day. And as they watched the inhabitants remaining in the land in their more sophisticated culture, they might be tempted to adopt their culture, to imitate and mimic their culture, even the sinful practices of their culture, ultimately worshiping the false gods of their culture. What Joshua is warning against here is the threat of cultural seduction that ends up worshiping the gods of culture. And so as we conclude this kind of first cycle through this A-B pattern, it might be helpful if we just kind of press pause and ask ourselves, what practices of culture are we kind of drifting toward? What cultural gods are we veering towards? Maybe we find ourselves drifting toward the gods of political partisanship or allegiance. Maybe it's the god of consumerism, or it could be the god of materialism or wealth. Maybe it's the god of sexual satisfaction, no matter what the cost. We could list several more, I assume. But what Joshua is cautioning us against here is getting seduced by culture in such a way that we end up worshiping the gods of culture. And so we are encouraged. Remember God's faithfulness. Be careful to obey his instructions. This cycle repeats itself again in verses 9 through 13. We're encouraged to remember in verses 9 and 10. The Lord has driven out before you great and powerful nations. To this day, no one has been able to withstand you. One of you routs 1,000 because the Lord your God fights for you, just as he promised. Remember, God is faithful to keep his promises. In the first remember section, back in verses 3 through 5, Joshua had mentioned how God fights for the people. Here, he kind of zeroes in on it. He wants the people of Israel to remember that no nation, no people group has been able to stand against God. He's highlighting God's power here, suggesting that if the people of Israel take a stand against God, they will fail. And by implication, if you or I ever take a stand against God, we too will fail. Remember God's faithfulness to his promises, and be careful to obey his instructions. Starting in verse 11, we move to the B section that challenges us to obey and gives us a warning of what happens if we don't. Verse 11 begins, "So be very careful to love the Lord your God. But if you turn away and ally yourselves with the survivors of these nations that remain among you, and if you intermarry with them and associate with them, then you may be sure that the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations before you. Instead, they will become snares and traps for you, whips on your backs and thorns in your eyes, until you perish from this good land, which the Lord your God has given you." Joshua begins this part of the cycle the same way that he began the first time around. Back in verse 6, when he started the obey section, he said, "Be strong, be careful." Here he repeats the "be very careful." To love the Lord your God, he says this time. If the warning or the caution the first time around in the obey section was a warning about cultural seduction, the warning this time around is relational seduction. Joshua highlights associations, intermarriage between the people of Israel and the inhabitants of the land. And it's not because Joshua is against intermarriage between different people groups. No, what he's concerned about is if an Israelite marries a foreign spouse, and that foreign spouse worships foreign gods, it's inevitable that those foreign gods will make their way into the home of the Israelite and end up competing with the one true God. It's really the same concern here as it was in the first round. With cultural seduction, the challenge was, if you get seduced by culture, you end up worshiping the gods of culture. If you get seduced in relationship, by relationship, you end up worshiping the gods of that relationship. Either way, the primary concern is gods that end up competing with the one true God. And Joshua says, if that happens, if you allow yourself to get seduced by the gods of culture, seduced by the gods of relationship, then God will stop fighting for you. The God who has been fighting for you will start to fight against you. God's the one who gave them the land, and God can take it away. It's a good reminder to us that what God gives, He's free to take away. So remember God's faithfulness and obey His instructions. We repeat that cycle again in the final few verses. He encourages us to remember in verse 14. "Now, I am about to go the way of all the earth. You know with all your heart and soul that not one of all the good promises the Lord your God gave you has failed. Every promise has been fulfilled. Not one has failed." That verse may sound familiar. It's pretty similar to what we read at the end of chapter 21. Here Joshua once again reminds the people that God has been faithful to keep His promises, and they are to remember how God has been faithful. But this time, the encouragement to remember is more of a setup for the warning that's going to follow in the B section. In the B section, the call to obey is more implied than explicitly stated. And it's really more of a warning. Notice verses 15 and 16. "But just as all the good things the Lord your God has promised you have come to you, so He will bring on you all the evil things He has threatened, until the Lord your God has destroyed you from this good land He has given you. If you violate the covenant of the Lord your God, which He commanded you, and go and serve other gods and bow down to them, the Lord's anger will burn against you, and you will quickly perish from the good land He has given you." And that's how Joshua's first farewell speech ends. On a note of judgment. Kind of a negative Nelly, Debbie Downer, cautionary Carl? Not really a positive note. It seems like maybe Joshua never took a preaching class. I mean, if Joshua had taken one of my preaching classes, he would know you're not supposed to end a sermon with a negative note of judgment. You end a sermon on a positive exhortation, a word of encouragement, a call to action, a note of inspiration. Not the Lord's anger will burn against you and you will quickly perish from the good land He has given you. The end. See you next week. Maybe, unless God judges you first. That's not really a word of closure for the people of Israel. And that's kind of the point. It's not supposed to bring closure to His hearers or His readers. It's supposed to prompt reflection and self-examination. And so maybe The proper way to conclude this session is to encourage you, to encourage myself, to reflect and self-examine in accordance with this A-B pattern. To remember God's faithfulness to his promises. In what way has God been faithful to you? In what way has God kept his promises to you? And then to encourage you, here's your call to action, to carefully obey his instructions. Remember God's faithfulness and be careful to obey his instructions.